Nació en una sociedad cerrada y subyugada por la religión. Sufrió sus maltratos en carne propia. Escapó, levantó su voz contra el fundamentalismo y la opresión religiosa y contra sus cultores y promotores. Por eso hoy vive amenazada. Una mujer valiente, excepcional, libre, imperdible. Nos viene a dar la otra mirada. Número 10, enero 2019.
Muy buenas tardes a todos. En nombre del equipo ejecutivo de La Otra Mirada, les doy la bienvenida a nuestra 9ª actividad desde el año 2014, cuando iniciamos este espacio abierto de discusión de ideas. Antes de empezar, quiero decir que nos encontramos ante un dilema, no sé si muy difícil o quizás imposible de resolver. Nuestra intención es tratar de ayudar a resolverlo, por cierto. ¿Se puede conciliar el concepto de justicia social redistributiva con una postura liberal clásica? ¿Debemos tomar esta pregunta como un intento de reconciliar a Marx y a Smith, o a Thatcher con Castro, o más cercano a casa a Vargas Llosa con Neruda? Mientras las poleras del Che no pasan de moda como emblema de superioridad moral, y mientras la nueva mayoría, o lo que queda de ella, y el Frente Amplio siguen profitando del discurso justiciero, algunos tildados de neoliberales, a lo mejor hay algunos por acá, sintiéndose arrinconados, podrían pensar que lo que se necesita es eso, una treta intelectual salomónica. Pues bien, hoy, tras varias sesiones de La Otra Mirada, ya capacitados para adentrarnos en un área más peliaguda, polémica, compleja, veremos cómo nuestro invitado no pretende vendernos un punto intermedio, ni reconciliar lo que desde una perspectiva de la dignidad de la persona es seguramente irreconciliable. Y veremos cómo nuestra postura liberal clásica nos ofrece respuestas que fortalecen la moralidad de nuestros argumentos. Les propongo abrir este encuentro con un poco de pasado y de arte. Las condiciones de vida de las personas y los hechos sociales y políticos, como objeto o tema, han estado presentes a lo largo de la historia intelectual y artística de la humanidad. La pobreza y sus consecuencias han ocupado un lugar muy relevante, especialmente en ciertas épocas. Por ejemplo, las miserias y precariedades fueron representadas de manera vívida en la pintura europea del siglo XIX, sugiriéndonos que era considerado importante por el artista y acaso por la sociedad en su conjunto. En el año 2002, los autores Howden Chapman y Mackenbach escribieron un artículo titulado Pobreza y pintura, representaciones en la Europa del siglo XIX. En él desarrollaron 6 categorías de imágenes: pecado y caridad, precariedad de la vivienda, desalojos y desamparo, condiciones de trabajo, hambre, crimen y riesgo del estilo de vida, enfermedad y muerte, revolución y sociedades visionarias. Así pintaron entre tantos otros Van Gogh, Daumier, Munch, Blake, Millet y Goya. Y había varias ideas más o menos constantes, como la asociación entre la pobreza y la enfermedad, la condena vitalicia de nacer en un medio miserable, la rápida expansión industrial y las malas condiciones de trabajo, la caridad como alivio. Lo que quiero destacar de esto es que, más allá de las precisiones y las sensibilidades morales de los artistas, las condiciones de vida de la humanidad en el siglo XIX y antes, por supuesto, eran bastante distintas de las actuales. Y tomo el ejemplo específico de Europa porque nos cuesta imaginar cómo países hoy bastante desarrollados y prósperos, con tan altos niveles de calidad de vida, unos más que otros, pudieron ser escenario, hasta hace relativamente poco tiempo, de carencias tan extendidas, excepto seguramente en los palacios y casas de la clase pudiente, donde en todo caso no existían muchas de las comodidades que hoy damos por descontadas. El célebre gráfico del palo de hockey que quizás ya muchos de ustedes han visto. Es una manera de mostrar cómo vivimos en tiempos pasados, como civilización humana en general. Fue durante gran parte de la humanidad, hasta hace muy poco, una vida miserable. La riqueza empezó a dispararse solo con eso que llamamos la revolución industrial. Lo que hemos experimentado en los últimos 2 siglos, y más aún en las más recientes décadas, ha sido sencillamente asombroso. Podría darles datos sobre la caída espectacular de la desnutrición y la pobreza, y cómo la expectativa de vida se ha duplicado en esta era, por ejemplo. Pero permítame entregarles solo 2 imágenes ilustrativas. Aún con los vaivenes de las economías y las angustias cotidianas, aún con las diferencias entre países, la clase media global ha emergido como nunca. Un informe del año pasado de la Brookings Institution, uno de los think tanks más prestigiosos del mundo, estimó para fines del 2016 en unos 3,2 billones las personas que componen este estrato, el segmento medio, más o menos la mitad de la población mundial. Si tomamos sus cifras, en la próxima década podríamos ser testigos de la expansión más rápida de la historia, a un ritmo de unas 150 millones de personas por año. De seguir así, la mayor parte del mundo tendrá estilo de vida de clase media o superiores. Un último número que me impresiona. La mitad de la humanidad está conectada a Internet. Estamos hablando de un invento de tan solo 27 años de edad. Hoy, de hecho, nos estamos preocupando de cómo conectarnos al resto, cómo conectar al resto de la gente que habita este planeta. El historiador israelí Yuval Noah Harari, autor de Sapiens y Homo Deus, dice que superamos la peste, el hambre y la guerra. Hoy buscamos la inmortalidad, la felicidad y la divinidad. Ahora bien, ¿a qué se debe todo esto? 2 importantes intelectuales que hemos tenido con nosotros en La Otra Mirada explican en sus modos y desde sus perspectivas que esto se debió a un proceso de evolución de las ideas, de las instituciones y de los valores. Ferguson habla de las aplicaciones demoledoras de Occidente, mientras Deirdre McCloskey reivindica las virtudes y la ética burguesas que impulsaron la innovación, el emprendimiento y la creación. Esto no ha sido entonces casual ni accidental. Las novedosas, revolucionarias y desafiantes ideas de la libertad, la tolerancia, el respeto y la dignidad han jugado un rol preponderante. No quiero ser demasiado simplista, pero si hacemos un cruce de los rankings de libertad económica y desarrollo humano, veremos una feliz e interesante coincidencia. Más o menos los mismos países que están en el primer tercio de los más libres son los que tienden a exhibir los mejores desempeños de desarrollo humano. ¿Suficiente? No creo. Pero si expandimos la observación a los índices de globalización, competitividad, facilidad para hacer negocios, democracia, transparencia y tantos más, veremos un cuadro bastante similar con un patrón cuando menos sugerente. Hong Kong, Nueva Zelanda, Estados Unidos, Dinamarca, etc. Son los mismos ejemplos que se repiten a diario, que ocupan los mejores resultados en desarrollo humano. Incluso nuestro país, por cierto. La economía de mercado, también la democracia liberal, tiende a aparecer entonces como una constante en aquellos puntos del mapa donde las personas viven mejor y su ausencia es característica de aquellos países donde la situación es menos atractiva y promisoria. Creo que los movimientos migratorios son una señal bastante consistente y en sintonía con estos datos. Recuerden parte del mensaje del hoy ministro José Ramón Valente en el libro que publicó el año 2015, La rebelión del sentido común. En la práctica, la gente de a pie sabe más de economía de lo que se cree. Más allá de lo que dicen o piensan los políticos e intelectuales, las personas en su día a día ejercen una gran capacidad crítica para juzgar y saber qué funciona y qué no. Y añado, aprecian el valor intrínseco de la libertad, más allá del instrumental. Ahora bien, ¿qué pasa cuando en países de buena situación, incluso bastante ricos, prósperos y libres, vemos tan intensas manifestaciones de descontento, miedo y tensión social? ¿Qué ¿Qué ocurre en una sociedad donde el mercado y la libertad parecen haber provisto tantos beneficios al tiempo que se alzan banderas y carteles en su contra? Existen varias explicaciones posibles, pero quiero recordar en particular al psicólogo social Jonathan Haidt, que el año pasado estuvo en este mismo escenario. Haidt explica la importancia de los valores morales, donde los correspondientes a cuidado, care, y justicia y proporcionalidad, fairness, tienen un gran peso en los sentimientos de la gente, en la política y en cómo las personas evalúan su entorno. Además, en su libro La hipótesis de la felicidad, habla del principio de adaptación. En general, tendemos a adaptarnos a nuestras malas y buenas situaciones. De acuerdo a estas, fijamos nuestros objetivos y expectativas. Los juicios sobre nuestro estado actual están basados en si es mejor o peor que aquel al que nos hemos acostumbrado. En muchos países prósperos, y en Chile también lo vemos, pienso que nuestra nueva normalidad nos ha llevado a fijarnos expectativas y metas mayores. Algunos autores, como Mauricio Rojas, hablan del malestar del éxito. La generación que ha experimentado nuestro inédito y rápido crecimiento puede manifestarse disconforme y protestar, pero no será por falta de techo o agua, tampoco por hambre o pobreza extrema, sino por equidad o igualdad, mejor educación, mejor salud, más asistencia o los llamados derechos sociales. Podría decirse que por otros elementos y niveles de cuidado y de justicia y proporcionalidad, para remitirse a los conceptos de Haidt. En este debate y en estas circunstancias nos encontramos en buena parte del mundo y, por supuesto, en Chile. Las preguntas con las que estamos lidiando no son nuevas ni peculiares a nuestro país. Por un lado, podemos distinguir un juicio moral contra eso que, con tono peyorativo, llaman el sistema neoliberal. Sus críticos más decididos lo consideran injusto por naturaleza, incluso vil y corrupto. Para ellos, la mano invisible de Smith es una mano negra, o en el mejor de los casos, incapaz de proveer justicia y equidad. El discurso del Frente Amplio en Chile tiene mucho de eso. En general, no ven que existe una manera de compatibilizar equidad y mercado, sino por el contrario, la necesidad de llevar incluso a restringir la libertad para garantizar la justicia. Favorecen una idea de libertad positiva, según la cual no hay verdadera libertad si no hay los medios para disfrutarla. Esto en perjuicio de la libertad negativa, es decir, de la ausencia de coacción y la posibilidad de hacer y actuar sin interferencias de terceros. Por otra parte, con respecto específicamente a la desigualdad y la inequidad, muchos las consideran defectos inadmisibles del mercado, conducentes a la dominación de unos sobre otros. Hace pocos años, Alberto Mayol, un intelectual de izquierda, miembro del Frente Amplio, afirmó que la desigualdad es un problema del corazón. Y claro, la economía liberal, desde esa perspectiva, carece o carecería de corazón. En nuestro país, este aspecto crítico ha sido un factor central del debate político y ha protagonizado incluso las contiendas electorales, poniendo en cuestión la continuidad de nuestras instituciones políticas y económicas. ¿Recuerdan la alusión del senador Quintana a la retroexcavadora para, cito textualmente, destruir los cimientos anquilosados del modelo neoliberal? El razonamiento anterior está en una posición bastante clara y fácilmente distinguible. Sin embargo, al interior del pensamiento liberal o dentro de las corrientes que aceptan el mercado, aunque con algunas reservas, o que buscan compatibilizar elementos, se abre otro mundo. Hay otro debate complejo por los matices, tanto en el ámbito filosófico como en el político, y con conceptos que se usan a veces de manera confusa o traslapándose entre sí. Por una parte, en el ámbito político intelectual, pasamos por las discusiones sobre la tercera vía y la socialdemocracia, especialmente en tiempos en que estuvo muy en boga y apareció Tony Blair, por ejemplo, como símbolo internacional. En Chile, a Ricardo Lagos, con su idea de crecer con igualdad, se le asocia a esta corriente, aunque muchos dudan y hasta le señalan como el más neoliberal de todos los concertacionistas. Por otra parte, se ha hablado de las distinciones entre economía liberal a secas, economía social de mercado y economía solidaria de mercado. Y ha habido, en torno a esto, debates sobre lo que realmente significaría cada cosa. Se ha reivindicado incluso como marca de legitimidad el origen de la economía social de mercado en esa Alemania de posguerra, que avanzó tremendamente, citando nombres de políticos e intelectuales como Erhard Röpke o Adenauer, entre otros. Esto, en todo caso, con interpretaciones no del todo coincidentes. Algunos destacan su verdadera esencia en la libertad del mercado y la limitación del Estado, mientras otros en la justicia social como un pilar fundamental del sistema. Pero siempre con ese tanto de tensión que enemista a los partidarios. En lo filosófico y en el campo liberal están las ya más o menos viejas diferencias entre liberales clásicos, liberales igualitarios y libertarios. La tensión entre libertades económicas y la denominada justicia social también ha generado importantes discusiones al interior del propio pensamiento liberal y ha estado presente en el debate teórico de los últimos 50 años. Los trabajos quizás más emblemáticos de Robert Nozick y John Rawls son una muestra. Ambas corrientes parecen tener como base premisas absolutamente distantes. Para una, el mercado carece de toda moral, como para ser fuente de justicia. Para la otra, la pretensión redistributiva carece de sustento moral porque imposibilita la existencia de un criterio de justicia que no vulnere las libertades más esenciales de los individuos, sobre todo las económicas. Hoy estamos con un nuevo gobierno, con discusiones sobre cambios y continuidades. Parece que no podemos evadir esta conversación, aunque el electorado, en un acto de sensatez, haya optado por la libertad. No obstante esto, debemos profundizar muy seriamente en este debate. Así, quedamos en el punto a donde quería llegar para presentar a nuestro invitado de hoy, el profesor John Tomasi. Tomasi es filósofo político en la Universidad de Brown, así como fundador y director del proyecto de teoría política. Su libro más reciente, Free Market Fairness, se basa en las ideas morales de los defensores de la libertad económica, como Hayek, y los defensores de la justicia social, como John Rawls. Plantea una perspectiva que intenta resolver el dilema que hemos mencionado. Analiza las diversas fuentes del pensamiento liberal, distinguiendo entre liberales clásicos, high liberals o igualitarios y libertarios. A partir de esta descripción de vertientes del pensamiento liberal, propone la posibilidad de encontrar un punto ético común basado en el reconocimiento de los fundamentos morales del mercado. El profesor Tomasi no es para nada un dogmático en el mundo liberal y está a la vez muy lejos de ser un socialista trasnochado como un Sanders o un marxista vintage tipo Jeremy Corbyn. Viene de una de las universidades estadounidenses capturadas por un profesorado de raigambre y simpatías socialistas, por lo que su trabajo tiene doble mérito. Así que será un gran aporte a esta discusión tan necesaria en este momento, que de seguro no resolveremos fácilmente, pero estoy cierto que nos llevará a ver la luz donde podrían haber algunos neobarronas. Muchas gracias y los dejo en unos instantes con John Tomasi.
Good evening. It's my great pleasure to be here. I enjoyed Nicholas's panoramic account of where we are and where we've come from. I want to begin by with a confession of sorts, or perhaps an explanation. I'm a philosopher, and philosophers are somewhat strange creatures, especially because what philosophers do will sound somewhat strange. I still remember vividly the day that I came home from college, and I told my mother, "Mom, I've decided that I want to be a philosopher." She was crushed. I'll tell you why, because it's actually relevant to what I'll be saying later. My mother had made just amazing sacrifices for many years throughout my youth to give me the opportunity to go to college. My father owned a small shop, and he died tragically when he was 39 years old. My mother never remarried. She raised me and my 3 sisters on her salary as a middle school art teacher. My mother believed deeply in education. She believed deeply in the idea of families taking care of their own. And so for her, launching us by giving us a chance to go to college was maybe the most important thing in her life. So when I came home and said to her with great enthusiasm, "I want to be a philosopher," you can imagine. So what do philosophers do? Philosophers do this somewhat strange thing where we don't study this world. We think about this world, but we don't study this world. We study the world that this world could become. And philosophers spend our time imagining and arguing with other philosophers about what an ideal society might look like. And the way I think of it sometimes is that philosophers make maps of the stars. It's a little grandiose, but that's kind of what we do. We make star maps. We try to point out constellations of an ideal features of a society that we think would be just and worthy of human beings to live in. So philosophers develop these ideas, these ideal societies, imaginary, strictly imaginary, because we hope, I think not vainly, that when the ships of state set sail, especially in democratic times, the citizens or the politicians or the political parties that steer the ship need something to guide them by. They need some star to help them steer, to know which direction the ship of state should go. The problem we face today, I think the central problem from a philosophical perspective that we face today, is that we have in the stars and the skies above us, the stars that the philosophers point out, 2 rival conceptions of an ideal society. And these conceptions, when I say they're rival, I mean they're in different points in the sky. And to steer toward one seems ipso facto to mean to steer away from the other. And I'll describe the two stars, the 2 constellations, just briefly. On one side, the left, there's a series of philosophers. I'm using John Rawls from Harvard, who wrote a great book called A Theory of Justice in 1972. And in A Theory of Justice, Rawls develops a theory of social justice. And Rawls is very indebted intellectually to Rousseau, Karl Marx, we could add. There's a whole group of sort of left thinkers who advocate social justice. And their idea, the idea of all this group on this side, the people who point to that constellation and who insist that that be the constellation to which ships should steer and to which citizens should have their alliance, their allegiance, the common idea is something like this. They say community is first. The wealth we see in our society is social wealth. It's the wealth of all of us. So when we ask what the government should do, the government should, on this conception, be fundamentally concerned to see that the social wealth is spread across all of the society. So they advocate a government of very expansive powers, especially in the economic realm, because they think the government needs to collect or monitor or control the passage, the movements of wealth, and they intentionally redistribute it in ways to try to achieve an ideal of social justice. And that side, from this perspective, they don't care much about economic liberty, or perhaps they're hostile to economic liberty, at the extreme versions, for example, with Marx. So we have on the left a theory, an ideal, that says economic liberty, not so much. Social justice, yes, all the way, the imperative. Across the way, on a different part of the sky, there's a different ideal. I used Friedrich Hayek and John Locke before him. We could add others, some of whom Nicholas mentioned. We could add Adam Smith, Milton Friedman, many others. These people on this side have a different ideal, and they have a different moral argument for that ideal, an argument that is also attractive. They say individual lives come first. Society is not an organic thing. There's no such thing as a society. There are just people, individual people. And every single person's life matters. People own themselves. Owning themselves, they own their labor. They should be respected to use that labor and their time the way they choose, since it's their life. They mix their labor with unowned things out in the world, a la John Locke, and they can come to own those things. Economic strivings, economic activities are among the most basic things that people do. And so when it comes time to ask what the government should do, these people say, these philosophers say, the central role of the government should be to protect the natural rights that people have, including, notably, their rights to property. And the role of the government is a more limited one, to provide a few public goods, perhaps, but mainly to protect people's rights. So they say, economic liberty, yes. Social justice, not at all. In fact, Friedrich Hayek wrote a book. I mentioned Rawls's book is called A Theory of Justice. Hayek wrote a book that some of you may know called The Mirage of Social Justice. He thought it was a fiction, perhaps. So this divide among the philosophers is only interesting to non-philosophers because it probably sounds pretty familiar to you. This divide among the philosophers mirrors a divide among many societies. I'm not sure, but I've been studying Chile from afar for some time with fascination. I think Chile is in many ways a uniquely positioned country because of the strength of the vision of these two rivals that have emerged in Chilean history. And I put down, for example, one politician, Michelle Bachelet. We could have put a stronger version, perhaps, maybe Allende, on the social justice side, perhaps. On the other side, a politician, I did Sebastián Piñera. We could have done the Chicago Boys, anyone you like, Sebastián de Castro, perhaps. Sergio de Castro. And when the politicians of various parties get their hands on the wheel of the state, of the ship of state, it's natural that they will turn it towards justice. They will turn it towards the constellation that they believe is the right one for the society, to make the society just. But if we have this division among ideals of justice, and we have a society like Chile where these both ideals seem to be alive, you have a course of journey that looks like this, and then like this, and then like this, and then like what? So we're faced with this dichotomy: social justice or economic liberty, democracy or capitalism, community or individualism, fairness or free markets. I'm interested, and I've been thinking and working on an idea that's still a new idea, and I'm not there with it at all. And maybe some of you will be able to help me understand it better, because I'm still working it out. But I'm interested in the possibility, the philosophical possibility, that there might be a different constellation. Not a compromise between the two existing constellations, but rather a separate constellation which rejects some bad, erroneous aspects of each of the existing constellations, but affirms a great moral insight within each existing constellation. And on the left, we're familiar with the idea of social democracy. On the right, we can call it libertarianism if you're a friend, or neoliberalism if you're an enemy. What I'm interested in is the possibility of a kind of hybrid ideal that I call market democracy. And the idea of market democracy, as I'll explain, is to try to ask ourselves, is there a way to work out an ideal that societies could, if they chose, steer themselves toward, that says economic liberty? Yes, strongly. Social justice? Yes, foundationally. Is that a possibility? This idea, this conception of social justice, this conception of justice or social justice, begins with the idea, I mentioned that on the left, they begin with the idea of community first. And the libertarians begin with the idea of the individuals first. Market democracy is based on an idea of the society as being a community of individuals. So it takes very seriously the idea that every person's life is really important, but it also takes very seriously the idea, just as seriously the idea, that we're all in this together, that we're all part of one community. And one way to sort of cash out what I mean by that is that I think from a market democratic perspective that I'll be describing, every person, every citizen has the ability to see the world from 2 points of view. We can see the world from our own eyes, and we can pause and perhaps look at our own lives and recognize that our life, each of our lives, is infinitely important. I actually think that we do that too seldomly, that we should take our lives more seriously than we do, and we'd have a better world if people took more time to pause and to think about how incredibly precious this opportunity of being alive is. But the first perspective, as I said, is the one where each of us can think to ourselves, you know, my life is important because it's the only life I have. It's natural, if you pause, which I hope you'll do, if you don't do it regularly, and think about how important your life is, how meaningful your life is. It's natural, if you think about that, to then look at people around you, each and every one of you, and think to yourself, that person's life is important too. That person's life is just as infinitely important to her or to him as my life is to me. After all, it's the only life that that person has. From those two ideas, those two moral ideas, I think you can start working out a theory of justice that takes economic liberty seriously and takes social justice seriously. And I'll just say a few words about both of those things, and then I'll end and we'll have some conversation. Am I okay for time? It's okay? You'll tell me? Okay. So, the way I think of it, I think the existing philosophical gladiators each got something right and each got something wrong. And I want to try to emphasize the good part in each of the existing gladiatorial viewpoints. First, regarding economic liberty. By economic liberty, I mean liberties of owning, the right to own private productive property, say to start a business. It also means, I also think, when I say economic liberty of owning, I'm thinking of the right to have income, to hold your income, to decide whether to save or whether to spend. I also think of economic liberties as including liberties of working, the right to decide which career you're going to follow, whatever your mother thinks. Also, I think it includes thicker things like the right to decide for yourself what percentage of your life and each day of your life you're going to be devoting to your career, and what part of your day and your time and your attention and your love and your desire you're going to be devoting to other things that are not part of work. It also means, I think, that one should have the right or has an interest in being able to choose for oneself how many hours one decides to work, and also perhaps what wage one's willing to accept for one's work. That's what I mean by economic liberty. Now, there's two ways to think about economic liberty. The Chicago boys, Milton Friedman and many others, did us a great service in pointing out and developing theories, Hayek probably especially, and developing theories about the instrumental importance of economic liberty. That is, they pointed out the economic benefits that will be produced by a society that takes seriously economic liberties. They use markets, allow us to use information very efficiently, local knowledge, for example, in Hayek's case. And markets allow us to take existing resources and steer them in the most effective directions, perhaps, the most productive directions. So there are lots of instrumental values to economic liberty. But what I want to emphasize, which is something that they sometimes touch on, but they don't quite really get it, but I think it's actually the most important part of economic liberty. The real deep value of economic liberty is the moral value of economic liberty. That is, as I see here, the intrinsic value of economic liberty. Part of that thing I said before, that part of that process about us recognizing that our life is important and setting ourselves on a course of life that's truly ours, a big part of that process, I believe, is structured and made up of economic decisions. People often express who they are. They decide the kind of person they're going to be by the decisions they make about working and saving and spending. I mentioned my mother before because she did that. My mother's life had lots of different aspects, but a central feature of what makes her who she is, what made her the person, the woman that she is, was this decision she made early on to live very simply, which I wasn't very happy about as a kid, to live very simply so that we'd have the chance to go to college. She made that choice, and it defines one of the great it probably was the great project of her life, that economic project. We define ourselves in all these. I was talking with some students this morning, and I was telling them that I had this experience at Brown and when I taught at Stanford and also when I was at Princeton. I noticed that freshmen and sophomores, first year and second year students, tend to be very happy. They come walking into my office, not a care in the world. They're taking a little art history. They are going to dabble in computer science, but it doesn't matter whether they'll stick with that or not. They can do this, they do that. I guess they study sometimes. But they have a lot of fun, and they're incredibly carefree, wonderful, magical creatures when they're freshmen and sophomores and juniors. But when they come to my office, having turned senior by their senior year, I detect a change in them. There's a certain tension in their jaw. Their smiles, they're less quick. There's a tick in their eye as they nervously get around to broaching the question of whether I'll write them a letter of recommendation for their investment banking program they decided to apply for, knowing full well that I'm going to say, but when you were in here last year, when you were so happy, you planned to be a social worker. But now you want a letter to be an investment banker? Or the kid in my office who tells me that he's going to become, he wants to get an MFA or he wants to become a public school teacher. And I said, but when you were in here last year, you told me that you were going to work in your father's hedge fund and that you've been working there every summer because preparing yourself to become to take over the family business and be a hedge fund manager. And now you're going to be a public school teacher? And I mention that because that unpleasant moment for them, that moment of tension for them, is that incredibly precious moment in their lives when they're crossing the threshold from childhood or late adolescence into something like adulthood. When they start to make these decisions about what career they're actually going to follow now, they're expressing what they value. They're making decisions that they struggle with, thinking about what are the economic consequences, what are the opportunity consequences, what are the moral consequences. I take no judgment about whether public school teachers or hedge fund managers are morally better. I genuinely take no view on that matter. But they're making these decisions for themselves, and they're becoming the people they are. So economic liberties, I think, are not important simply because they make the world, make the economy better. They're important because they're an essential part of freedom. And if you want to live in a society where we truly respect our fellow citizens, we need to respect all the domains of activity in which they become themselves. So if you want to pursue social justice, for example, which I'll say about in a moment, if you want to pursue social justice in a respectful way, we need to be very thoughtful about the ways people need to have economic freedom to become the kind of people they want to become on their own terms. So a truly respectful society, a morally respectful society, should give great weight to people's ability to use their economic freedoms. Secondly, and more briefly, you probably think this is the complicated one. It's actually not, I don't think. Social justice. What is social justice? I think it's remarkably easy to say, because what most people think it is so it's easy to say why what most people think it is wrong. So most people who think, many people think, and some of the people I mentioned on the left side thought, that social justice means something like equality. Maybe material equality, maybe equality of opportunity, but they had the idea that to make a society, sorry, that's a bit crude to do that. I just realized after half an hour of doing it. To make a society just, or to make it more just, one should make it more equal, right? So just think about that idea. It's a pretty common idea. Imagine we have a society that has a distribution of, let's say, wealth that's roughly like this. Wealth and opportunities, we might say. And now, on that theory, that social justice means equality, how do we make the society more just? Well, we make it more equal. So insofar as we make the society more equal in its holdings, we're making the society more just. That's not as simple as it sounds, but if that's the theory, then we have to hold ourselves to that theory and accept the consequences that come with it. So, for example, you probably can expect what I'm going to do right now. Imagine this society, and now someone says, let's make it more just. We make it more just, and people are getting poorer, but notice my fingers are getting closer. They're getting closer still. I can go right down onto the ground. Well, you can't see it anymore, but my fingers are really close right now, and everyone in the society is really, really poor, but they're all equally really, really poor, so they're all really equal, so this must be a really super just society. That's got to be wrong. So social justice can't be about equality. It has to be about something else. When people talk about, when they feel attracted to the idea of making society more equal, they actually don't care about the society being equal. There's some caveats we could add there, but just for now, just leave it in the simple form. What they really care about is the poor. And they think that by making society more equal, you help the poor. That means what they really mean, what they really care about, and what they should care about, and what we all should care about, is the poor. We should care about not equality, but what I'll call priority. So now imagine two different societies, that two different institutions, two different ideologies in place that generate distributions over time. One of them creates a distribution kind of like this, like I said before, fairly equal. The other society, though, let's say, it generates a distribution that's unequal, like this. On the priority approach to social justice, we don't ask relational questions about the top and the bottom in the society. Instead, we focus our attention on the poorest, weakest, most disadvantaged people in our society. We ask, how are the poorest among us doing? We, to put it this kind of crudely, watch my thumbs, we ask about these people. And we ask, which of these two societies, if we could choose to create to pick social institutions to make our society realize one of these distributions, which one of these societies should we choose if we truly cared about everyone in society? And on the priority conception, they say, I say, we choose this society. We accept, let's say, some inequality because what we care about is the poor, the most poor. So, social justice is a matter of focusing our attention on the poorest members of society, not worrying so much about equality. There can be some bounds. If I could take my finger and break it and stick it up really high and make it super, super unequal, maybe there's a problem with that society. I think there is. But the simplest model, though, is that it's priority that we owe our fellow citizens, not equality. So where are we? I'm interested in Chile because in your history, there's been at least in the recent history, but in some of your earlier history too, there's been a zigzag path between the two ideals that I described. I haven't fully worked out, I'm well aware, the account of market democracy that I think is what justice really is. But I think you see the general aim, the general outlines of what I'm going for. I'm thinking about a society that is committed absolutely to the idea that in a decent, just society, no one should be left behind. There should be no class of people who are dropped off, who aren't part of this social process. In every society, in my society in America, in your society in Chile, that is the case now. There are whole swaths of people who are not genuinely involved in the society. Lives, precious lives, that are not being fully developed. Opportunities for their geniuses out there, undiscovered, who will never be discovered, never even be heard from, living in slums and in poverty, maybe illiterate. We owe all our fellow citizens the chance to be authors of their own lives, the chance to be people who can stand up and live a life that's valuable to them. And at the same time, when we do that, when we accept that commitment, accept that great insight, which I think is a great insight from the left, that great service, that great moral service that the left has done us, we have to recognize, we can't lose sight of the fact that economic liberties are among the most important parts of personal freedom. That if we want to create a welfare program that realizes our concern to leave no one behind, we have to be extremely mindful of the importance of personal freedom to people, especially in the economic realm. And regarding the Chilean case, as I was saying this to some students this morning, and I'll say it the same way to you, I think part of the question is, first we have to decide what's the most attractive form of society. Is it the community one that says social justice, yes, economic liberty, no? I don't think so. Is it the orthodox neoliberal one that says economic liberty, yes, social justice, no? I don't think so. I think it's something in between but also higher than either of them, a mixing of these two ideas of economic liberty and social justice. And then the question, if some of you come to agree with me that that's a moral ideal that a society should aim for, then the question is one of will. And how does a society that's divided and that's been raised to think that there's two different sets of stars, either you're with us or you're against us, the people who oppose you are your enemies, and you're two camps locked in struggle like that, how do we develop the broadness of mind, the breadth of heart that it would take for people to overcome that divide and find a way to truly work together to see whether these two important ideals can be made to fit in a functioning way within a society. I heard some years ago that there was a term of virtue among Chileans called convivencia, coexistence, seeing the other side. I don't know whether that virtue is still part of the Chilean mindset, but something like that idea, a willingness to be open to the other people, a willingness to not just wear the T-shirt of your team, but to take T-shirts off, put flags down, and actually think about what it would really mean to create a social world that expressed our concern for everyone, and especially the most poor, that might be the kind of thing that might enable us to rise above our pre-existing ideological commitments, to disappoint some of our old friends, as I've done, and work together to try to create a new idea of social justice. Thank you. I'll end with that.
You go sit down a little while.
Okay.
And then I will. Thank you, John. I must say something. While I was hearing you, I was looking at your outfit, your sneaker and your suit. And I thought that maybe your theory to bring together social justice and economic freedom is like to put a suit with sneaker. And I can tell you, it works very good. It looks very cool. Bueno, vamos a hacer un juego ahora, como lo hicimos con Vargas Llosa, y como dijimos la otra vez, hay dos maneras de presentarle a la audiencia a un invitado. Una es decir que aquí hay gente muy importante, hombres y mujeres, se me olvidó, y gente que toma decisiones, ¿no es cierto? Y la otra es saber si de verdad estamos de acuerdo con lo que plantea John y su teoría sobre la libertad del mercado. Entonces, vamos a hacer una pequeña encuesta que nosotros en la tercera complementamos con una muestra de 5.000 personas. Vamos a ir comparando las respuestas y dar algunas conclusiones. Todos tienen esto cerca de su asiento, atrás, adelante, no tengo idea. Este juego es súper simple, pero con Mario Vargas Llosa habían 1.000 personas y apretaron los botoncitos 200. Hay un problema. Entonces tenemos que superar ese récord para que esto sea representativo. Entonces, muy simple, como dice ahí, van a salir las preguntas, tienen que presionar por 2 segundos en la teclera y vamos a ver qué es lo que resulta de cada una de estas cosas. A ver, vamos con la primera pregunta. Entonces, muy simple, ¿consideras que la economía de mercado y sus instituciones te han beneficiado en lo personal, sí o no? Entonces presionan 2 segundos y vamos a tener esto. Está claro, ¿no? Esta es una audiencia privilegiada porque la encuesta del diario La Tercera, con 5.000 respuestas, ¿no es cierto? Si bien fue también mayoritario, solo el 65% de la gente pensó que lo había beneficiado personalmente. Pero acá tenemos puros privilegiados, un 93% que están contentos con lo que ha pasado. La segunda pregunta, para ir avanzando, es un poco más amplia. ¿Crees que la sociedad chilena en su conjunto se ha beneficiado de la economía de libre mercado? Entonces ahora podemos decir sí o no. 1, alternativa sí. 2, alternativa no. ...86% dice que sí, y esto se compara con un 60% de lo que responde la muestra más grande, es decir, pero vamos marcando, es decir, incluso en una mayor cantidad de gente, 5.000 casos es una muestra bastante grande, incluso ahí sale que un 60% de la gente cree que la sociedad como un todo se ha beneficiado del libre mercado. Ahora vamos a hacer la tercera, que es ¿quiénes creen que son los más beneficiados por la economía del libre mercado? Ahí hay 4 alternativas: empresarios, gobierno, grupos de bajos recursos, todos, y yo mismo. Y bueno, hay 5 alternativas, ustedes tienen que elegir cuál les motiva más. Bueno, tenemos todos gana por 54%, y seguido por los empresarios con un 38%, y en la encuesta de la tercera, los empresarios son los que más ganan en esta respuesta, y con un 58%. Es decir, esta muestra es un poco más benigna hacia el mercado de lo que resulta ser la otra. Vamos a la cuarta. ¿Cuál ha sido el principal aporte del sistema económico en Chile? Ha generado mayor riqueza, ha aumentado la libertad para emprender, ha generado mayor empleo y ha conectado a Chile con el mundo. Son las 4 alternativas y vamos a elegir una. Ha generado mayor riqueza, ¿no es cierto?, con un 54%. Ahora, nosotros hicimos una trampa en esta pregunta porque le agregamos una alternativa distinta. Pusimos si ha generado mayor riqueza, pero también si ha generado mayor desigualdad. Y en la muestra general ha generado mayor riqueza, sacó 37%, y mayor desigualdad 31%. O sea, está medio empatada la cosa y por lo tanto no son comparables con el resto, pero digamos que ha generado mayor riqueza, es la respuesta mayoritaria que tienen todos. Y la última pregunta es, esta es re fácil elegir, pero bueno, si tuvieras que emigrar a un país con tu familia, ¿a dónde te irías? Claro, típico que sale Bolivia. Australia. Muy empatado con Estados Unidos. Bueno, nosotros acá también incluimos otro país, que fue Suecia, que además es un país muy querido por John, y en la encuesta de la tercera, Suecia arrasó con un 55% de los votos. Bueno, probablemente hubiera estado acá, a lo mejor todos ustedes hubieran querido a Suecia, no creo. Pero en fin, Australia, que por lo demás es el destino favorito de todos sus hijos. Claro. Por el clima nada más, pero en fin. Quisiera decirle, para terminar, lo siguiente. En la encuesta de la tercera era más bien un test, ¿no es cierto?, donde se calificaba a las personas en qué grado aceptaban el mercado o no, y aquellos que finalmente, después de responder todas estas preguntas, calificaban el mercado como cruel y dañino, fue solo el 19% de la muestra, solo el 19%, y a aquellos que solo les importa el mercado y nada más, fue el 24%, y el 56% dijo que le gustaba la economía social de mercado. Y yo creo que esto es el tema de John, en que la gente necesita ponerle el apellido social al mercado. Yo creo que eso es súper importante, y como dice John ahora y en una entrevista que dio el domingo, en Chile políticamente estamos como separados lo social y lo económico, pero es la economía social de mercado lo que le hace sentido a mucha gente. Ni siquiera es lo social solamente, el mercado solamente. Entonces, esta tarea en que está John me parece a mí muy relevante. Para profundizar en esto, vamos a invitar nuevamente a John, que lo va a acompañar Leonidas Montes, director del Centro de Estudios Públicos, y van a tener una conversación sobre el tema. Muchas gracias.
On my right or my left?
Oh, good.
Well, thank you, all of you, for being here. And
So I'm on, I'm on their no, I'm on their left.
on their left. And thank you, La Otra Mirada, for the opportunity of sharing with John Tomasi. I think, John, that you are in very good company with Jonathan Haidt, Deirdre McCloskey, as you saw, who else recently, Mario Vargas Llosa, etc. I must confess something, because I received a call at 4 in the afternoon, and it was from the organizer of this event, and she told me, well, listen, what are you going to talk about? And I said, well, I don't know. And I added, maybe we can talk about roles to principles or Hayek's theory of spontaneous order. And I heard a silence. So I said, well, listen, I mean, if you were in an Indian restaurant, you would have to rank your food as hot or not. From 1 to 10, what do you want? Because it could be 7, I said, in terms of intellectual conversation. And she said, well, listen, better 5, okay? So we cannot talk about that much. And she gave me 2 instructions that I have to give at the end, and it's only 25 minutes. Well, one of the things, I mean, remembering what you've done, we have to remember, Nicolas introduced you already, but you studied your DPhil at Oxford. You have published extensively on political philosophy and political theory, but your book, your Free Market Fairness, has been very influential in academic and even political circles, in this idea of bringing together Rawls and Hayek, or having a close-in between the thought of these 2 great thinkers. It could be interesting in a way to try to explain the audience what is Rawls' basic thought, and then Hayek, and why you choose these 2 big thinkers in terms of your proposal.
Sure. Should I stand up so that people can see? Is that okay?
I think you have a microphone. Speak loud.
Okay. Pull forward a little bit. So I chose Rawls and Hayek because they're the thinkers who I admire the most. I grew up studying Rawls when I was at Oxford because that's what you had to do. He's the most technical political philosopher of the last 50 years. So those of us who want to be real philosophers had to prove we could do the hard stuff. I read Rawls and disliked almost everything he said. I resented it tremendously, being required to study and restudy a thinker whose conclusions and premises I profoundly disagreed with. Hayek was studied much less often in the academy, at least among political philosophers. That made me genuinely want to study Hayek. So I studied Hayek kind of at night, on my own, secretly, but with great passion and with great interest. And so because I knew those 2 thinkers the best, and because they're often thought of as being great rivals of each other. They weren't, as I think you know, but they were widely presented to people in my generation as having been arch rivals, even though, in fact, they had a very interesting relationship together. Hayek was very encouraging of the young John Rawls. He thought that John Rawls, when John Rawls was a first-year assistant professor, Hayek said this may be the most important thinker of the next generation. And this is from a very devoted defender of the free market, aware that a new giant might soon be rising who might might overthrow some of the things that Rawls thought that Hayek thought was very important. So I think that that's why I chose them, because they were so central to the debate.
And another detail I noticed in your book that you quote Milton Friedman only twice, related to education, and Hayek is extensively quoted along the book.
I know.
So, I mean,
terrible.
would you make a distinction between classical liberalism and libertarianism? How would you define that difference? Because I think that's an important issue.
Well, I should say first that Milton Friedman was an extremely important person in my life. And he taught me something that was, it's an embarrassing story to tell you, but I'll share it with you because I think I owe it to him. I won a prize early in my career when I was just starting to think about political philosophy. I won a prize that gave me the chance to go to Chicago to meet Milton Friedman. And at the time, I was just beginning my studies of political philosophy, and I was extremely sure of myself, and I was extremely sure that Milton Friedman was a sellout to the left. I thought he was, a moderate, which in my view back then, I was an extreme free market radical. And I'm embarrassed to say that when I had the chance to go to Chicago to meet with him, he was in a room with a number of his students, probably some of the Chicago boys, who knows, a little later than that. But I was rude to him, looking back on it. I asked him very aggressive questions, very uncompromising, very, very inappropriate for a young man to do to a very distinguished thinker, because I thought that all that mattered was the ideas, and who cares about whether we're polite or not? We just need to get the ideas right. And I was so passionate about that, and I was so sure that he was having this great influence in telling people the wrong things, that I had to try to convince him to become more hardcore in the free market. Some of his students defended him. Rather, he didn't actually reply to me even himself. And I left feeling very embarrassed and somewhat ashamed about myself. Years later, he sent me a note, completely out of the blue, just a very friendly note saying that he'd read something I'd written, he thought it was really interesting, and he was really happy to see my career taking off. And then very late in his life, just before he died, I was invited to give a keynote address at a group called the Montpelier Society in London. And Milton Friedman was going to come to introduce me and two other people who the title was New Thinkers, New Ideas, something like that. They're going to allow some person who was now thinking about social justice into the Montpelier Society, which the tables had been turned, right? But Milton Friedman became very ill shortly before he died, and he sent a video instead. And in his video, to my shame, he complimented me, and he described meeting me those years before, that day that I so often at night would think to myself, God, I can't believe I was a jerk to Milton Friedman. And he complimented me, and I'm sorry, I say all that because there was a generosity of spirit that he displayed toward me that I've never forgotten. There was something humane about that. There's something about getting beyond the ideological, getting beyond even a young person's rudeness to try to reach them anyway. And sometimes when I'm at Brown or when I'm involved in political situations and I can encounter extremely angry people, in my experience, usually people who are very angry on the left, who are very rude to me, who sometimes people shout at me when I give talks because they think I'm a shill for the free market because I think it's so important, economic liberty is so important. I try to remember how Milton Friedman was with me. And I try to remember that when some person's in the back chanting or yelling at me, as has happened sometimes in the circles I travel in, that they were kind of like me. They really care. And that if I could have the generosity of spirit that Milton Friedman genuinely had, it would be a wonderful thing. And if I could, I share it with you in part because I hope that you too will think about that generosity of spirit. It's the only way a society can really move forward is if we're brave enough and we're big enough and we're wise enough to recognize that even people who are completely wrong and are yelling in our faces are still people. And if we're patient and we're sincere, there's power in that. I have no idea what you're... Sorry.
Well, that testimony at the end of the day is something very common that they had together. Friedman and Hayek, they were very generous with their opponents or adversaries.
Yes.
and in all their writings and their engagings, they were like that. But coming back to, if you see any difference, what would you call libertarian against classical liberal in a sense?
Yes. Okay, yes. Okay, I'm sorry. I missed
No,
that.
no, that's because
Yeah, so on the cover of my book, an economist named Tyler Cowen describes it as a book about libertarianism. And I appreciate Tyler Cowen saying positive things about my book. It's actually a book about classical liberalism. And part of my idea, kind of my bigger project that I'm working on, is I think that free market thinking became dominated, certainly for people of my generation, by very hardcore libertarians. I've been a hardcore libertarian, so I know what that's like. I know the world. I know the attitude. But I think if we think about classical, the deeper tradition, the true liberal tradition back in its beginnings, and actually what first got me interested in this stuff personally, Adam Smith, who I think of as the first true liberal. Adam Smith was obviously a genius talking about the importance of markets, but he constantly talked about the poor. Adam Smith talked so much about the poor that in his day he was criticized for that. Robert Malthus wrote a letter criticizing Smith, saying, "Would you just stop talking about poverty all the time? Let's just get back to talking about other parts of society." And that's really important, I think, to realize that there's a tradition within classical liberalism that's broader and prior to the libertarian extremism that is more flexible. It allows the kind of flexibility that I criticize Milton Friedman for, to allow for there to be some taxation, and not calling all taxation theft, allowing there could be an important role for the government. That it's kind of we're all part of a discovery, involved in a discovery process, to see how a government can help people take tax money to genuinely help our fellow citizens without eroding on their economic freedoms. So classical liberalism, unlike strict libertarianism, is a more expansive doctrine. It's a more flexible doctrine. It's a doctrine that says we could pursue social justice perhaps with the help of government, but not strictly by having markets solve all their problems.
in this kind of Aristotelian immediate virtues that you try to join social justice and economic liberty. And it was nice in your presentation because it was the girl pushing harder the economic liberty thing.
I looked hard for that.
Yeah, it was on purpose. and in that pursuit, what do you think in political terms? Because in Chile, Milton Friedman is very well known, as you are aware. And Hayek perhaps has been rather neglected in intellectual terms, although he had a big influence in Chile also.
Yes.
But how would you combine these two issues in real political terms?
May I say something first about the woman pushing the...
Yeah, sure.
So that was very intentional, and I was really delighted. I looked for a long time before I could find the pieces that I wanted, because I wanted a woman to push the economic liberty. And the reason is that I think I told you that I watched my mother, and I learned a lot from her about the importance of economic liberty. So I knew that, just as a way of, like I know anything in the world, knowing my mother, I knew that. But I didn't really start to understand the academic arguments for economic liberty until I stumbled upon feminism. And so I started reading, this is when I was in Oxford, also stuff I read at night. I started reading 19th century feminists. And these feminists said this remarkable thing. They said that, in different ways they would say it, but they would say something like this: women could be given all the gilded material means in the world. They could be given nice homes. They could be given the respect of having doors open for them. They could be given buildings. They could be situated in a beautifully crafted gilded cage with a swing that would swing quietly on whatever swing quietly on gears. They could be given a little seed container made fresh every morning when they woke up, so they could have fresh food and water. Women can be given all the gilded material means in the world, but if they were denied the chance to be part of the cause of that state of affairs, if they were denied economic liberties, if they were denied the kind of full equality of a citizen who wants to feel that they did something themselves, that they had a project that was theirs, then no matter how much stuff we'd given them, we disrespected them. And when I read those feminists, I kept thinking about the European social democracies. And I kept thinking about the idea of trying to measure the care of a society towards the poor in terms of the size of our social welfare programs. And I realized that that was missing something huge, that there's a kind of, this, like I put it negatively, I'll put it positively, that there's a missed opportunity. If we measure the size of our hearts by the size of our welfare programs, we're missing the opportunity to think maybe there's a higher ideal, an ideal where we try to empower people, respect people, give them the opportunities to stand on their own 2 feet, as women in the 19th century saw so vividly. So, sorry, that's why. So I really wanted to find a woman to push the econ liberty for that reason. That's kind of an inside thing. I didn't expect to share that with you. But I didn't answer.
In the wonderful interview you gave for La Tercera on Sunday, you talk about Chile and you say it's fascinating because it has, and I quote you, all the ingredients for an ideal of free market and an ideal of social justice, and you put the example of Sweden.
Yes.
How do you make that link? Now, that's going to be interesting.
So, you know, when you write a book, you don't know if anybody's going to read it. And when you write a book, even if you think someone's going to read it, you're usually wrong about who reads it. And so I wrote my book thinking, well, you know, I hope that some of my American colleagues will read it. And they did. But I was very surprised at the countries where my book became really popular. And the biggest surprise of all was Sweden. So I had an invitation shortly after the book came out to give a talk in Stockholm, and I said yes. But when people heard I was coming, I started getting more and more invitations. So in my 7 days in Stockholm, I gave as many talks as I'm giving here, which is like 3 or 4 a day. But on the airplane to Sweden, I'm a philosopher. I'm so ignorant about the world. I want to learn about Sweden. So I literally sat on the plane, paid for my internet service, and I Googled something like economics Sweden. That's literally where I was. And so, and I started finding these YouTube videos of this person I'd never heard of before. He was this guy with long blonde ponytail, Swedish guy, right? Long blonde ponytail, gold earring, and he was there, like, you know, looking like what I think a Swedish person looks like. He's a politician in Sweden. But behind him on the screen were the banners of my old free market think tanks. So there was this guy, this long-haired, ponytailed, hippie Swede, and behind him it said, you know, the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, and closest to my heart, Cato Institute, the hardcore libertarians. And when I listened to this person, I said, how could, his name is Anders Borg, and he's the finance minister of Sweden. And he was talking about my book. He didn't mention me. He's read it now. He hadn't read it at that point. But he was exactly describing my book and my idea. And the thing he said was that in Sweden, we shouldn't judge our success by the size of our welfare programs. Instead, our welfare programs are a sign of our failure. So long as we have welfare programs, that means we failed to give every Swedish person the chance to be independent, to live an autonomous life, fully according to their own values. And he had this line. One more thing I have to say. He had this line. I just love this line. He said it in every talk. And then he went around Europe, by the way, and was lecturing the Europeans about how they should be more like Sweden, using this particular line that I just loved. And the line, he talked about his policies. His whole thrust of his policies, he says, was this: we want to make work more comfortable than welfare. We want to make work more comfortable than welfare. Imagine if a Republican presidential candidate in America, or perhaps President Piñera in Chile, said, our idea for our program is to make work more comfortable than welfare. We're going to get people off the welfare rolls by making them uncomfortable, designing them to be so uncomfortable. What? But he said that because he saw the aim of the welfare program as being to launch people. That Sweden should try to design welfare programs to encourage people to become genuine members of the society. He could say that. He could get away with saying that. He could be lionized for saying that, even in Sweden, because there was this background shared understanding among the Swedes that they truly were a community. There was a deep cultural sense of belief in each other, that they were all in this together. And that if someone was going to say something like that, like those words, it would not be easy just to take pot shots at that person for being a heartless, uncaring person. There was the background commitment to social justice. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to encourage my friends on the right, my old libertarian friends, to see the importance of social justice. That if we could genuinely affirm the idea of trying to build a society together that leaves no one behind, that includes all the talented people, all the special, precious individuals that we have in the world right now living, that if we could actually convince people of our sincerity of that, because we actually were sincere about that, or became sincere about that, then we can have honest conversations about making a better world. That's why I like Sweden, for that reason.
You mentioned, John, this idea that the state or the government ships moves to the right or to the left, and you gave the example of Chile, moving from Allende to the Chicago Boys, then Piñera to Bachelet, Bachelet to Piñera. How do you find, what do we need in order to find that combination between social justice? Do we need a sort of Smithian sympathy? How would you face politically that challenge?
I think it starts with people like you and people in the audience, and with people like the students I spoke with this morning. I think it starts with ordinary people having the seriousness of concern for our fellow citizens, the seriousness of commitment to certain principles of individual liberty, the willingness to stand up for those principles, to share them with people, to not always say the comfortable things, but sometimes to say it politely. It's more powerful if you're polite, as I've learned. To politely say the uncomfortable thing. It means having a willingness to begin a conversation among our friends, among colleagues, among people that we can reach. Ideas, in the end of the day, I think do rule the world. We philosophers, like I said, we're weird. But there is something about, through time, these ideals are what move people. Political parties will play their games and do various things to try to get coalitions together. But behind that, there are these moral calls that really have power. I think part of the great lesson of socialism and the rise and failure of socialism in the last century was just the power of the moral idea. And socialism, for such a long time, cornered the market on calling attention and, I think importantly, making visible the poverty that people live in our world. They did that really important thing, but they cornered the market on the moral high ground. Never give up the moral high ground.
Well, we are on time. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your seminar at Universidad de Concepción, because apparently you had hundreds of students hearing you. Yes. But I have two messages that the organizer told me I had to give. First, leave this here, okay? Second, we have free drinks upstairs at first floor, so we can carry on talking with John. And well, many thanks for the conversation and for your visit, and hope you enjoy your time in Chile.
Thank you. Thank you.